Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to another bone-chilling episode of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and tonight we're diving into stories that take us beyond the realm of the ordinary, into places where what you read and where you sit could seal your fate. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed tonight's show, be sure to leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. And if you're joining us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button, drop a comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to click that bell icon so you never miss a terrifying tale. And for those of you who crave even more, head over to chillingtalesfordarknights.com and become a patron. Enjoy all of our content ad-free, plus get exclusive access to perks that will keep your nightmares well-fed. Now, sit back, relax if you dare, and let's turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Our first story tonight comes from the twisted mind of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights creator, Craig Groshek. Education is supposed to be a gateway to opportunity, a gift given to young minds eager to learn. But sometimes, books hold more than just knowledge. Sometimes, they whisper back. Sometimes, the story is reading you. Performed by Justine Anastasia. This is Reading Circle by Craig Groshek.
Part 1. The cold in Vermont was the kind that burrowed deep, settling into your bones and refusing to leave. It had been a relentless winter, one of record-breaking storms and ice-glazed roads, and the tutoring center's converted church basement felt barely warmer than the outside. But I was determined. Teaching in these conditions was no picnic, but for the 5 kids who'd signed up for the weekly reading circle, it was worth it. They deserved more than what this small, underfunded town could offer. My name is Claire Donovan, and I work with students who struggle with reading. Dyslexia, learning disabilities, anxiety, you name it. It's not glamorous and it doesn't pay well, but it feels important. It's not every day you find work that aligns with your belief that everyone deserves a fair shot at understanding the world. That's how I justified my impulse buy at the estate sale. It had been a Saturday morning, one of those rare Vermont days where the sky was clear and the roads were passable. The flyer for the sale had caught my eye while I was waiting in line for coffee. Harker Estate, antiques, books, and collectibles. I was always on the lookout for interesting material to use in lessons, and the mention of books hooked me. The Harker Estate was something straight out of a Gothic novel. A dilapidated Victorian sat at the top of a winding driveway, its windows boarded up and its shingles warped from decades of neglect. A cluster of cars, mostly pickups, filled the gravel lot near the porch. The relatives, cousins I think, had opened the house to the public, selling off anything they could to cover debts and funeral costs. They greeted me with polite indifference and waved me toward the living room where most of the books were piled in chaotic stacks. It smelled like dust and mildew inside, but there was something else underneath, a faint metallic tang I couldn't place, I chalked it up to old pipes or the sour tang of neglect, but I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder as I browsed the shelves. The books were a strange mix of the mundane and the strange. Yellowed medical journals, a crumbling set of encyclopedias, and outdated cookbooks. And then there was The Watcher's Delight. It was tucked beneath a stack of paperbacks, its leather cover cracked and soft from wear. The illustration on the front showed a whimsical scene. Woodland animals gathered around a tall figure in a robe, its face obscured by a hood. The title was embossed in gold, its letters curling like vines. It was charming in a way that felt almost magical, and I thought my students might appreciate the novelty. "How much for this one?" I asked, holding it up. "Take it," said the woman organizing the books. "Anything that's not gone by today is going in the trash." Later, I found myself lingering in the kitchen, listening to the relatives talk. One of them, a tall man in a Red Sox cap, was explaining how the house had been locked up for years after Thomas Harker's death. "Margaret was the weird one," he said, shaking his head. "Always talking about energies and symbols. She had the place full of junk when she died. Tommy just shoved it all in that back room and locked it up. Didn't want to deal with it." "Like what?" I asked, curious despite myself. The man shrugged. "Books, papers, weird stuff. They found symbols painted on the walls when they cleared it out. Probably just her trying to keep people out." That should have been my first red flag. Back at the tutoring center, I added the book to my stack of lesson materials, running my finger over the cover one more time. It was odd, but not unwelcoming. Quirky, in a way that I thought might intrigue my students. If I felt a faint chill as I handled it, I ignored it. After all, it was just a book. Part 2. The tutoring center was quiet that evening, the kind of silence only winter can bring. The thick snow muffled everything, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above. My students filtered in one by one, each bundled in puffy coats and scarves, leaving trails of snow behind them. "Grab some cocoa before we start," I called out, nodding toward the thermos and paper cups I'd set up on a folding table. Ben, the first to arrive, mumbled a thank you as he poured himself a cup, his hand shaking slightly from the cold. He was 12, painfully shy and dyslexic, but he worked harder than anyone in the group. Sophie came next, pulling off her mittens with nervous energy. She was 11 and the most eager, though her confidence was fragile. Luke arrived third, as he always did, wearing his usual skeptical expression. 13, with a sharp tongue and an attitude that said he'd rather be anywhere else. Mason and Mia came together last. Mason, 10, looked like he'd seen a ghost every time he opened a book, and Mia, 12, was whip smart, but easily distracted. "Okay, settle in," I said, waving them to the semicircle of chairs I'd arranged. "Tonight's going to be fun." Luke snorted. "Fun? Reading? Pick one." "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Luke," I said dryly. "Let's see if I can change your mind." I reached for The Watcher's Delight, holding it up so they could see the embossed cover. "This is a little different from what we usually do. It's an old children's book, and I thought it might be fun to read together." Sophie leaned forward, intrigued. "Where did you get it?" "An estate sale. It's got woodland animals and a mysterious figure in a hood. Maybe a wizard or something. Thought you'd like it." Mason shifted in his chair, looking uneasy. "It's kinda creepy," he muttered. "It's not creepy," Sophie said, though her voice wavered. "It's cute, right?" "Exactly," I said, flipping open the book. "See? Look at these illustrations." I passed it around, letting them study the first page. A fox, a rabbit, and a bird gathered beneath a tree as the hooded figure stood nearby, holding what looked like a staff. The colors were muted, like old watercolors, but there was something oddly compelling about the image. Ben was the last to take the book. He stared at the page, his lips moving silently as he tried to parse the text. "Do I have to go first?" "Only if you want to," I said, taking the book back. "How about Sophie starts us off?" The first few sentences were innocuous enough, describing a forest at dusk and the animals preparing for a gathering. Sophie read slowly, her voice trembling slightly as she struggled with a few unfamiliar words. But then the text shifted. "The watchers stir where the veil grows thin," she read. I frowned. That didn't sound like something from a children's book. Sophie hesitated. "Is that right?" I leaned over her shoulder to look at the page. The words seemed perfectly ordinary to me. The fox and the rabbit watched the moon rise. "You're doing great," I said. "Keep going." She continued, but her voice faltered again. The watchers are hungry?" The room seemed to grow colder. "What did you say?" I asked. "The watchers are hungry," Sophie repeated. "That's what it says." I looked at the page again, and this time I saw it. The words didn't match what I remembered. "Let me see," Luke said, snatching the book. "Careful," I warned, but I let him have it. He skimmed the page, his eyes narrowing. "It's just animals talking, no watchers. You guys are imagining things." Mason looked unconvinced. "Then why does it feel weird in here?" "It doesn't feel weird," Luke shot back, though his face had gone pale. "It's just a story," I said, trying to regain control of the group. "Let's keep reading." Luke reluctantly read the next passage aloud. His voice was steady at first, but then he stumbled. "The veil parts for the chosen kin? What the heck does that mean?" I took the book back. The words were clear as day to me. The owl flew through the night, calling to its friends. "Good effort, Luke," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "Mason, why don't you give it a try?" Mason shook his head violently. "No way." "Come on, it's just a book." "No," he said, his voice rising. "It's not." The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the fluorescent lights flickered. Sophie screamed, pointing toward the corner. "What's wrong?" I demanded, following her gaze. "There's something there," she cried. "Something where?" She pointed again, trembling. "By the wall. It's tall, and it's staring at you." I turned to Luke. "Do you see anything?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It's like a shadow, but it's moving." "Stop it," I said firmly. "You're scaring Mason." Mason whimpered, burying his face in his hands. "It's whispering," he said. "I can hear it whispering." I grabbed the book, snapping it shut. "Okay, that's enough. We're done for tonight." "But," Sophie started. "No buts," I said. "Go get your coats. I'll walk you all to the door." The students obeyed reluctantly, casting nervous glances over their shoulders as they left the circle. I stayed behind to clean up, my hands trembling as I picked up the book. The leather cover felt colder than before, almost icy. Part 3. I couldn't stop thinking about the book. Even after the kids had left, their fear stayed with me. Sophie's screams, Mason's whimpers, Luke's pale face. All of it churned in my mind like a storm. I'd brought books into my reading circles 100 times, and never once had something like this happened. The book wasn't just a book. I knew that much. What I didn't know was how or why it had this effect. It was past 10 by the time I locked up the tutoring center. The air outside was sharp enough to bite, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I walked to my car. I tossed the book into the passenger seat, determined to figure out what was going on. The next day, I returned to the tutoring center early, hoping to make sense of the Watcher's Delight before the next session. I sat at my desk, flipping through its pages. The illustrations were as enchanting as ever. Woodland animals gathering beneath the trees, their eyes bright with curiosity. But something about them made my stomach twist. The hooded figure, the one that had seemed whimsical at first, was more detailed than I remembered. Its robes were covered in faint symbols, barely visible unless you looked closely. And its face. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was something unnatural about its blankness. I read through the text slowly, taking notes on anything unusual. At first, it seemed harmless, typical children's story fare. But as I reached the middle, the tone shifted. Phrases like, "the veil stirs," and "the watchers wait," sent chills crawling up my spine. When I reached the line, "the watchers hunger for a path," the room grew colder. I snapped the book shut. That evening, the kids arrived for their second session of the week. They were quieter than usual, their laughter subdued. Even Luke seemed on edge, his usual sarcasm replaced with silence. "You guys okay?" I asked. Sophie nodded, but her eyes darted to the corner of the room. "Is the book still here?" "It's just a book," I said firmly. "Nothing to be afraid of." Mason's expression was etched with worry. "It didn't feel like just a book." I wanted to reassure them, but I couldn't lie. I'd felt it too, that creeping sense of wrongness. "We won't use it tonight," I promised. The session started smoothly enough. I brought out some lighter material, encouraging the kids to take turns reading from familiar stories, and seemed to work, at least for a little while. But then the lights flickered. Sophie froze mid-sentence. "Did you see that?" "It's just the old wiring," I said quickly. The temperature dropped again, more sharply this time. Luke shifted in his seat, glancing toward the same corner Sophie had pointed at the night before. "There's something there," he said. I followed his gaze, but all I saw was shadow. "Luke, there's nothing." The words died in my throat. The shadow moved. It was subtle, like the flicker of a flame, but it was enough. I stared, willing my eyes to see something, anything, more clearly. "I told you," Sophie cried. Mason whimpered, clutching his knees. "It's whispering again," he said. "It's louder this time." The room felt wrong, stretched, warped in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, like they were swallowing the weak fluorescent light. Luke stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. "I'm not staying in here." "Luke, sit down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why? So we can wait for whatever this thing is to grab us?" "There's nothing in here," I said, but even as I spoke, I didn't believe it. Sophie's eyes widened as she pointed toward the back of the room. "It's moving again," she said quietly. I turned just in time to see the shadow elongate, stretching unnaturally toward the center of the room. I grabbed the book, yanking it off my desk. "This is the problem," I said. "It's this stupid thing." "What are you doing?" Mia asked. "Getting rid of it." I threw the book into a trash can and pulled a lighter from my bag. I hesitated for only a second before flicking the flame to life and holding it to the book's corner. But it didn't burn. The flame licked at the cover, but the leather remained untouched, as cold and smooth as ever. "What the hell?" Luke rasped. I tried again, this time holding the flame closer. Nothing, not even a scorch mark. Desperation clawed at me. I ripped the book out of the trash can and tore at its pages, expecting them to shred easily. But the paper didn't give. Instead, it stretched, as if made of something far tougher than paper. A low hum filled the room, growing louder with each attempt. "What's happening?" Sophie cried. "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. Finally, a page gave way with a loud snap. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of triumph, until something small and black scuttled out of the torn paper. It looked like a spider at first, but its movements were wrong, too quick, too jagged. Sophie screamed as more of the creatures emerged, skittering across the floor. They weren't spiders. They weren't anything I'd ever seen. "Get on the chairs!" I shouted. The kids scrambled onto their seats, and I grabbed a broom, swiping at the creatures as they darted toward us. Mason whimpered. "They're everywhere," he said. And he was right. The creatures were multiplying, pouring out of the book like water from a broken dam. I knew then that the book wasn't just cursed, it was alive. Part 4. The tutoring center felt like a different place now. Shadows pressed against the edges of the room, their depth unnatural, as though the walls had expanded into a void I couldn't comprehend. And the creatures, those tiny alien things, continued to skitter across the floor. I stood in the center of the room, gripping the broom like a lifeline, surrounded by the kids perched on their chairs. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and darting. Sophie clung to the back of her chair, her knuckles white, while Luke muttered curses under his breath, his usual bravado long gone. Mason was crying softly, his knees pulled to his chest. I didn't know what to do. "This isn't real," I said aloud, as much to myself as to them. This can't be real." "It is real," Sophie snapped. "You see them now, don't you?" "I see something," I admitted, my voice trembling. The book was still on the floor, lying open where I'd thrown it. Its pages fluttered as though caught in a breeze, though the air was still. Every time a page moved, more of those small, spindly creatures seemed to crawl out, their jointed limbs clicking against the tile. "We have to stop it," Luke said. "We have to, destroy it or something." "I tried that," I said. "It won't burn, it won't rip." "Then what do we do?" Mia asked, her voice sharp with panic. The answer came, oddly enough, from Mason. He was staring at the book, his face streaked with tears, when he muttered, "It's alive." "What?" I said, turning to him. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "The book, it's alive. It's like it wants us to read it." I froze, his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't wrong. Every time we'd read it aloud, the book had reacted, changing the words, summoning creatures, making the room colder and darker. The book wasn't just a conduit for whatever was happening. It was the source. I knelt down, hesitant, and picked the book up again. The leather cover felt colder than ever, almost painful against my skin. The symbols etched into it seemed to writhe as I stared at them, like they were alive too. I said slowly, "I think we have to finish it." "What?" Sophie gasped. "Finish the story," I said, though the words felt wrong in my mouth. The book is alive, but it's also a ritual disguised as a story. If we complete it, maybe we can, close it somehow. "That's crazy," Luke said. "What if it just makes everything worse?" "It's already worse," I said, gesturing to the creatures now crawling up the walls. "Do you have a better idea?" I flipped the book open, my hands trembling. The pages no longer looked like paper. They shimmered, as though made of liquid light. The words glowed faintly, and I had the eerie sense that they were watching me. "I'll read," I said. "You all stay on the chairs. Don't move unless I say so." "No way," Sophie said. "We're not letting you do this alone." Before I could stop her, she jumped off her chair and knelt beside me. The others followed, one by one, until we were all sitting in a circle on the cold floor, the book resting between us. I took a deep breath and began to read. The words were foreign, their meaning slipping through my mind like water through a sieve. But as I spoke them aloud, the room shifted again. The shadows on the walls twisted, taking on grotesque shapes. The creatures on the floor paused, their heads, or what passed for heads, snapping toward me in unison. I kept reading. Sophie took over when my voice faltered, her tone shaky but determined. Then Luke, then Mia, each of us passing the book like a torch. The words flowed, a mixture of English and something ancient, something I couldn't fully understand but felt deep in my bones. The final passage was the worst. It wasn't just words, it was something more. Speaking it felt like peeling back a layer of reality, exposing something raw and terrible beneath. My voice cracked as I read, and the temperature plummeted further, frost creeping across the floor. The creatures screamed. It wasn't a sound I could describe. It wasn't meant for human ears, but it filled the room. rattling my teeth and making my vision blur. I forced myself to keep going, my voice rising above the cacophony. As the last word left my lips, the book erupted in a blinding flash of light. The creatures dissolved, their forms collapsing into smoke. The shadows on the walls receded, and the warped dimensions of the room snapped back into place. The air warmed, and everything went still. I stared at the book. It was still there, its cover singed but intact. The symbols on its surface had faded, and the pages were blank. "We did it," Sophie whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, I wasn't so sure. Part 5. The book was gone. Not physically. It still sat on my desk, its once ornate cover now singed and faded, the pages blank. But its power had vanished. Whatever dark force had been bound to it seemed to have dissipated during the ritual. And yet, the uneasy feeling lingered. I couldn't sleep that night. My dreams were fractured. Flashes of shadows stretching across walls, of words twisting on the page, of the creature's screams echoing in the darkness. When I woke, the unease clung to me like a second skin. I needed answers. The next morning, I called the Harker relatives who had run the estate sale. It took a few tries, but eventually, a tired-sounding woman answered. "Yeah, I remember you," she said after I introduced myself. "You're the one who took that old children's book, right?" "Yes," I said. "I need to know more about it, about the Harkers, about Margaret specifically." There was a pause. "Why?" I hesitated, unsure about how much to reveal. "It caused some trouble during a tutoring session. I think it might have been valuable. Historically, I mean." The woman snorted. "Valuable? Lady, if you'd seen the rest of the junk in that house, you wouldn't be saying that. Half the stuff was so weird we didn't know what to do with it. Ended up dumping most of it in the landfill." "Wait," I said. "You dumped it?" "Yeah. Anything we couldn't sell or didn't want. The house was packed with all this creepy crap. Margaret's old books, her journals, even these paintings she did of, I don't know, symbols or something. Gave me the chills just looking at them." My stomach dropped. Which landfill? By noon, I was standing at the edge of the landfill. The stench of rotting garbage thickened the air. The woman at the gate had been reluctant to let me in, but a $20 bill and a convincing sob story had changed her mind. "You're looking for books?" she asked, incredulous. "Yes," I said. "Old ones, leather covers, probably buried under a bunch of other junk." She shook her head. "Good luck." The search was grueling. I waded through mounds of trash, picking through broken furniture, moldy clothes, and shattered glass. The cold air bit at my exposed skin, and my gloves did little to protect my fingers. Hours passed. My boots were soaked through, my back ached, and I was on the verge of giving up when I spotted it. A trunk half buried beneath a pile of old newspapers. It was locked, but the wood was rotted enough that I could pry it open with a nearby metal rod. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed fabric, were Margaret Harker's journals. The journals were heavier than they looked, their leather covers cracked and warped from years of neglect. I carried them to my car, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the pages. Margaret's handwriting was cramped and chaotic, her words scrawled in a mix of English and symbols I didn't recognize. At first, the entries seemed harmless, rambles about her love of literature and her frustration with the small-mindedness of the townspeople. But as I read on, the tone shifted. She began writing about rituals. Margaret had been deeply involved in the occult. She believed that books could be used as vessels for summoning and binding entities, their rituals disguised as harmless children's stories. She wrote about her experiments, about the symbols she painted in the house, about the watchers she hoped to control. The words on the page seemed to crawl as I read them, and I had to stop more than once. I felt like I was being watched. One entry stood out. The Watcher's delight succeeded beyond my expectations. The veil stirred. I glimpsed them, just for a moment, their forms terrible and magnificent, but they are restless, hungry. They demand more than I can give. Margaret's final entries were frantic, detailing her growing fear of the Watchers and her desperate attempts to lock her books away. She begged her husband to destroy them, but he refused. I can't undo what I've done. All I can do is hide it and pray no one ever opens them again. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The book I'd brought into my tutoring center hadn't just been a fluke. It was part of a deliberate plan, a spell disguised as a story. And Margaret's warning echoed in my mind. They are restless, hungry. Part 6. I couldn't bring myself to sleep that night. Every shadow in my apartment felt too dark, every creak of the floorboards too loud. I sat at my kitchen table, Margaret Harker's journals spread out before me, and forced myself to keep reading. The more I read, the more I understood. Margaret hadn't just dabbled in the occult, she'd immersed herself in it. Her experiments weren't accidents or idle curiosities. They were deliberate, calculated attempts to pierce the boundaries of reality. She believed the Watchers existed in a liminal space, caught between worlds, and her books were designed to lure them closer. And she had succeeded. Her journals spoke of other books, each containing its own ritual, each designed to summon something different. The Watcher's delight was just one of many. The thought chilled me. If there were others like it, how many more unsuspecting people might stumble upon them? The next day, I returned to the tutoring center. It felt different now, quieter than usual. The kids had gone home safe that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about what they had seen, how much this experience scarred them. The book was still on my desk, its pages blank and lifeless. It looked harmless now, but I worried it was only dormant. I considered burning it again, but I remembered how it had resisted the flames before. Instead, I locked it in a filing cabinet and shoved the key into my pocket. That evening, as I prepared for bed, a strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a low hum of awareness, a tingling at the back of my neck. I turned off the lights and crawled under the covers, but sleep didn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic creaks of the old building as the wind howled outside. And then I heard it. A whisper. I sat up. The sound was faint, but it was there. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway. I opened my door, expecting to see nothing, but the murmuring grew louder. It wasn't words. It was more like the sound of rustling paper, an unsteady rhythm that set my teeth on edge. I followed the sound to my desk. The journals were still there, untouched, but as I leaned closer, the whispering stopped. I stared at them for a long moment, my pulse racing. Then slowly, I opened the top journal to the last page. There, scrawled in Margaret's cramped handwriting, was a single sentence I hadn't noticed before. They will never leave you. The days that followed were a blur. The murmurs came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to wake me in the middle of the night. I began to see shadows flicker in the corners of my vision, shapes that vanished as soon as I turned to look. I told myself it was paranoia, the lingering effects of what had happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Watchers weren't gone. I wasn't sure if they were tied to me, or to the book, or to the ritual we had completed. Maybe it didn't matter. They had marked me somehow, and I could feel their presence wherever I went. A week later, a package arrived. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. I hesitated before opening it, my hands trembling as I slid a knife through the tape. Inside was another book. Its cover was black, its edges worn. The title, embossed in faded silver, read, "The Weaver's Hymn." Beneath it was a single note, written in a hand I didn't recognize. "The Watchers remember. They are waiting." I stared at the book, my stomach churning. The air in the room felt heavier and colder, as though the Watchers were already here, waiting for me to open it, and they would not be ignored. For a long moment, I sat frozen, unsure whether I ought to burn it, bury it, or throw it in the nearest lake. But then, slowly, I reached out and opened the cover, and I began to read.
That was The Reading Circle by Craig Groshek, as performed by Justine Anastasia. And if there's one thing I've learned tonight, it's that not all books are meant to be opened. Some should stay locked away, forgotten, lest something on the other side of the page decides to take a closer look at you. Craig Groshek, as many of you know, is the founder of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and its ever-growing horror network, crafting nightmares for millions across YouTube, podcasts, and beyond. His ability to weave slow, burning, creeping horror is why his stories resonate long after the lights go out. And if you want more of Craig's work, be sure to visit creepypastastories.com, where you'll find not only his terrifying tales, but hundreds of other chilling original stories you won't find anywhere else. And with that, let's keep the terror rolling, shall we? One story down, and the darkness is only growing thicker. But if that eerie tale of forbidden knowledge didn't unsettle you, perhaps this next one will. Carnivals, county fairs, places of laughter, neon lights, and the smell of fried food in the air. But what if I told you that some rides aren't just for entertainment? That some cars never should have been occupied at all? Our next story takes us to a traveling fairground, where an unassuming father finds himself face to face with something that wasn't listed in the attractions. But first, allow me to tell you a bit about our second featured author. Jasper DeWitt is no stranger to horror. Many of you may recognize him as the author of the infamous nosleep story, The Patient That Nearly Drove Me Out of Medicine, now available as The Patient on Amazon. And if that name rings a bell, it should. His story is currently being adapted into a feature-length film courtesy of Ryan Reynolds' production company. But tonight, he brings us a different kind of horror, a horror that lurks in the mundane, waiting for the right moment to take its next victim. Performed by Nick Goroff and featuring Olivia Steele, I present to you The Red Car by Jasper DeWitt.
I'm never going back on that ride ever again. And I sure as hell am not taking my kid anywhere near it. Yeah, I know. You've probably heard something like that from plenty of people. Haunted theme parks are a distinct category of creepy urban legends, and I'm sure you've heard more than your fair share of them. But here's the thing. Most of the theme parks I hear creepy stories about are no longer in operation. Some horrible past event shut them down, or they became haunted after going bankrupt, or, well, it's always some variation on that kind of narrative. Those are good stories, but this isn't a spooky story. It's a cautionary tale. I'm not going to tell you about how I and my grown-up friends went back someplace we weren't supposed to, or how my kid wandered into the ruins of some forgotten, spirit-infested heap. Because you could probably avoid those places because they're just that. Specific, geographically fixed places. But I'm not sure you can avoid the ride I'm talking about. and what's on it. Because the thing is, this story isn't about some boarded-up haunted theme park. This story took place instead at a county fair. And if you don't know, those sorts of fairs don't usually have dedicated pre-built rides. Instead, they have an assortment of buckets and bolts that travel from state to state and set up wherever a particular county's fair needs an extra ride. So, while I'm going to talk about my experience at that particular fair in California, you honestly might never know if your fair might have the exact same ride wheeled in next. This is why, to save you from reading the whole story before you even find out what to avoid, I'll just lead with this. If you ever see a ride at your county fair called Blizzard Bobsled, make sure that neither you, your kid, nor anyone else you love goes on it alone. And if, by some chance, they sneak on, you just pray that the ride is crowded enough that someone has to take the seat next to them. Got it? Good. Now, I'll tell you why. I'll give you just a minimal background about myself. As I said, this took place in California, specifically in a relatively sleepy part of the state just north of its center, right along the coast, which is where I live. I'm a single father with one child, a beautiful little 10-year-old girl named Michelle. Michelle doesn't know anything about what I'm about to tell you. I pray she doesn't find this story, because I don't want to worry her and give her nightmares about something she escaped by pure luck. At least, I desperately hope she escaped. Yes, she must have. She didn't look. I know that for a fact. And it's all that lets me sleep. She didn't look. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It's been a tradition in our family to go to the county fair near where we live whenever it's open, which is usually around the spring to summer. Even if I wanted to, I don't think Michelle would let me forget. She is obsessed with those rides. Every time we go, she jumps on every single one that she's not too old or too short for, and she seems to take it as a personal failure if she doesn't ride it at least 3 times once she's gotten the staff to let her on. I can't remember the last time we didn't spend at least one day at the fair where we arrived right when it opened and then left immediately after it closed. Suffice it to say, I've become very familiar with which rides are regular attractions and which only come to town for a single engagement. The Zipper, for example, is there every year, and so are the spinning teacups. But I know for a fact that the Blizzard Bobsled was not one of these regular visitors. In fact, I'm pretty certain that I hadn't seen it before I went with my daughter just a week ago. Of course, it goes beyond saying that I will not forget it now, and I pray to God it doesn't come back. As I said earlier, Michelle insists on riding every attraction at least 3 times if she can convince the staff to let her. This particular ride, however, forced her to violate that principle by paternal fiat, which is a source of great relief for me. When we first saw Blizzard Bobsled, I didn't see it as a threat, except perhaps to my stomach if I rode it. It was one of those whirling, nausea-inducing contraptions where you lock yourself in with a couple of bars and ride the car in a circle up and down before going backward and repeating the same path at a much faster speed, and then going back and forwards even faster. As you've probably guessed from the name, on Blizzard Bobsled, the cars were shaped like bobsleds of various garish colors, and the entire decor of the ride was conspicuously Arctic-themed. Michelle waited in line for upwards of half an hour, but she didn't seem to care once the gates opened and the kids streamed onto the ride, taking every available seat. Well, not quite everyone. There was one red car, which had been conspicuously marked with an out-of-order sign, which stayed empty. I didn't think much of this at the time. Some carny was probably just too lazy to detach it. I just waved to my baby Michelle and snapped a couple of pictures of her excitement before I heard the loudspeaker ask everyone to check their seatbelts, and then heard the loud, blaring alarm and grinding gears that signaled it was starting. Idly, I glanced over the line of cars as they began to move and saw something strange. The red car, with the out-of-order sign on it, wasn't empty. A man, a grown man, was suddenly sitting in it, just on the outside seat of the back row of the four-person car. At that distance, I'd say he was probably 6 feet tall, wearing a dusty button-down shirt with a tear down one of the arms, a pair of tattered jeans, and some cheap, holey boots. I couldn't make out what his face looked like because his head was craned at an almost unnaturally sharp angle toward the center of the ride, and his hair was too long and unkempt for me to make out what was behind it. I thought he might be some punk kid who'd snuck on and taken the out-of-order car for thrills, and I almost ran up to the operators to tell them to stop the ride and get him off. But even if I had, it would have been too late to avoid danger entirely, because by the time I fully realized what I was seeing, the ride was already at its first full speed. I wondered with some ghoulish curiosity whether I might be about to witness one of those infamous accidents that happen when people don't adhere to proper safety. But instead, I witnessed something much more disturbing. When the red car came into view again, the man was still sitting in it, unscathed. But, and this was the main thing, he wasn't sitting in the back row of the car anymore. He was now sitting in the front. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined his original position at first, so I chalked this up to me just not looking closely enough. But then the car rounded the corner again, and when he came back into view, he was in the back again. And it went on like this for the entire ride. He just kept warping between the back and front rows of his own car with each rotation of the ride. Not that you could tell it from looking, because his posture remained so exact that you could have sworn he was a statue. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I knew I didn't like my daughter being anywhere close to it. Abruptly, the ride stopped. One of the kids had thrown up, prompting an anxious parent to insist the staff let the child off. Bawling, the delicate unfortunate in question walked off, and with the same buzzing crank, the ride started up again. It was when the now half-empty row, where the sick kid had been, had come back into view that I realized that this kid had been sitting next to my daughter. I felt a little anxious seeing that empty seat, given what I was already seeing in the out-of-order car, but I wasn't sure if the ghost or whatever it was could move beyond that car yet. That is, until the cars rounded the corner one last time, and I saw something that made my heart stop. My daughter was holding her arms in the air, her eyes shut to enjoy the pure exhilaration, but she was no longer alone in that car. The man from the red car, which had been at least 6 cars behind hers, was suddenly sitting right beside her, staring at her with the same relentless gaze he'd been directing at the innards of the ride just moments ago. I rushed over to try and get the operators to stop the ride, but that seemed to be the final turn as the alarm blared and the cars began to slow down. I looked up, waiting with bated breath for them to stop. Michelle came back into view, her eyes open this time, but there was no sign of the man beside her. He'd vanished. I looked with some trepidation at the red car he'd started in, but he wasn't there either. I shuddered, and when Michelle got off the ride, I practically ran to pick her up and hold her out of protective terror. She didn't seem to mind the hug for the first few seconds, but as I didn't let go, she craned her head to look at me reproachfully.
What's wrong, Daddy?
I looked back at her, still feeling my own fear behind my gaze, and asked as calmly as I could. Michelle, when you were on that ride, did you see anything weird? She looked at me quizzically.
I didn't see anything, Daddy. My eyes were shut the whole time. You know I always do that.
I breathed a sigh of relief and put her down. She looked up at me expectantly.
Can we go on the Ferris wheel now? Please?
Yes, I said with an audible sigh of relief. Yes, of course you can. Come on. The Ferris wheel was a few rides down, and I felt unspeakably relieved knowing that Michelle would be spending the next few minutes hundreds of feet off the ground, far away from whatever I'd seen on Blizzard Bobsled. Thankfully, the next few hours of our visit passed peacefully, during which time I felt a little courage leak back into my system, and I came to a difficult decision. I was going to find out what was on that ride, even if it meant getting on it myself. By the time I had come to this rather foolhardy conclusion, the crowds had thinned out at all the rides. So while Michelle took her second run at one of the roller coasters, which just happened to be 2 rides away from Blizzard Bobsled, I made my way up through the fairly thin line of people and up to that suddenly far more frightening attraction. When I reached the side, I made a beeline for the red car with the out-of-order sign, wondering if I could somehow sneak on without the staff noticing. After all, they hadn't noticed the man, or whatever he was, so perhaps I could take advantage of their laxity. To my surprise, before I even managed to get into the car, I felt a hand tap me on the shoulder and heard a curt voice in my ear. "Can't you read the sign, pal?" I looked back at the angry and rather burly ride operator standing behind me and did my best to look confused. "Sorry, I thought I saw another guy in there a while back. I didn't know if the sign was for real." At my mention of another guy, I almost thought I saw the carney's face lose a little blood. He shook his head at me curtly. "No one's allowed in that car, sir." That wasn't going to work for me. I wanted an answer. "Then what about the guy I saw?" "Sir, am I going to have to ask you to leave?" "Not if you just answer me that question, no. I'll just pop in another car and be out of your hair." The carny seemed to deflate, and he leaned into me. "That other guy you saw is why you can't ride this car, sir. And don't ask any more questions because that's all I'm going to say." I nodded, now suddenly wondering what the operators of this ride knew that I didn't. But not to be cowed, I instead took the closest car to the red one that I could find with an empty row of seats. It was only after fastening my seatbelt that I saw a notice plastered on the seat in front of me with some rather odd instructions. "If you don't have a buddy for Blizzard Bobsled, please keep your eyes closed for your safety." I looked up at the seat in front of me, where a callow-looking young man in camouflage cargo pants and a South Park hoodie, stinking of weed, was also sitting alone. I saw a similar notice in the same place. I poked him and nodded my head at it. "Hey, dude," I said with what, in retrospect, was probably the most paternal inflection possible. "What do you think that's about?" I pointed at the sign. The young man gave me a tired and annoyed look. How should I know, Pops? Probably some nonsense in case a kid knocks their head on the bars. Now leave me alone. Charming. I wasn't going to get any more out of him. And besides, the alarm had just gone off and the cars had begun to move. I kept my eyes open right up until we turned around out of sight of the fair and squeezed them shut as tightly as I could without losing vision completely. Then, I brushed my hand to the side ever so softly and felt my fingers connect with something that felt like damp fabric wrapped around something cold. I moved my finger back on reflex and strained my eyes to get a look at what was next to me without turning my head. I couldn't see more than the ripped shirt and the beaten up jeans, but what my eyes didn't pick up, my ears and nose did. There was a sudden, disgusting smell, like opening up a leftover steak weeks after it's gone bad, which seemed to crawl into my nostrils. And while my eyes might have been mostly shut, I could still feel the cold, invasive proximity of that thing leaning its face into mine. I could hear a musty, slow inhalation, followed by an even slower exhalation, and I realized that it must have been sniffing me. I shut my eyes and waited for the ride to turn around again. When it did, the smell and the breathing were gone. I opened my eyes again, this time wide enough to see what was happening in the seat before me. The figure was now sitting next to that smart-ass kid I'd talked to earlier. And unlike me, the kid apparently hadn't decided to heed the warning. He was staring at that face obscured by that matted tangle of hair with a look of transfixed, indescribable terror. Like a rabbit that's just been cornered by a wolf. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And as he did so, the thing leaned in further and seemed to press its face against his. It was like watching the most grotesque, invasive imitation of a kiss in the world. I shut my eyes and didn't open them for the rest of the ride. When the ride finally slowed down, I did open them, of course. The kid was still sitting in the seat ahead of me, but he didn't look terrified anymore. He looked oddly relieved, actually. Then, with a faster and more confident stride than I would have expected from a stoner, he stood up and walked out of the ride. I didn't know what else to do, so I followed him out and met Michelle outside the roller coaster. It was only as I turned away from my former ride-mate that I noticed something that froze my blood. His camouflage cargo pants and South Park hoodie were nowhere to be seen. Instead, he wore a pair of old jeans, some ancient-looking, well-worn boots, and a yellowing dress shirt with one sleeve torn open. I left with Michelle as soon as I found her. She complained, but a sufficiently large bribe of pizza and cotton candy seemed to do the trick in assuaging her damaged sense of honor. I didn't bother taking another look at Blizzard Bobsled before we left. I knew what I'd probably see, and my curiosity was gone. And if you've been paying attention, yours should be too. If you're the type who goes to county fairs and you see a ride called Blizzard Bobsled with one red car holding an out-of-order sign, please keep yourself and your loved ones away from it.
That was The Red Car by Jasper DeWitt, as performed by Goroff, featuring Olivia Steele. And let this be a warning to all you thrill seekers out there. Next time you're at the fair, if you see a ride with an out-of-order sign on one of the seats, maybe, just maybe, leave it empty. Some things are better left alone. Jasper DeWitt continues to leave his mark in the horror world, not just online, but soon on the big screen. If you're intrigued by his brand of psychological terror, check out The Patient on Amazon and keep an eye out for the upcoming film adaptation. And just like that, dear listeners, another journey into darkness comes to a close. But before we go, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us on this unsettling ride through shadowed pages and cursed carnival seats. If tonight's stories left you with a shiver down your spine, help support Chilling Tales for Dark Nights by leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And for those of you watching on YouTube, a like, a comment, and a subscribe go a long way in keeping the nightmares alive. And if you really want to keep the horror coming, visit chillingtalesfordarknights.com and become a patron. For as little as $7.99 a month or less with an annual subscription, you can enjoy ad-free content, exclusive stories, and early access to the horrors yet to come. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and as always, it's been a pleasure creeping into your ears. Tune in every Monday and Wednesday for more terrifying tales. And remember, let's turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Until next time, sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.
Thank you.